So today's lesson is going to be covering the first set of fraction vocabulary words that you'll need. We'll do the second set here in another couple of weeks when we transition between adding and subtracting fractions into multiplying and dividing fractions. So our first word is fraction. All right, I think most of us know what a fraction is, or at least what it looks like. Okay, a fraction is a symbol such as 2/3, 5/1, or 8/5, used to describe one or more parts of a whole that is divided into equal parts. Now, that equal word is really important because the parts of a fraction have to be the same. Okay, I can't have a pizza that, it's cut into half and then a half of it is cut into some other kind of number and expect that those are equal, because they're not. Okay, a fraction can name part of a whole, a part of a set, a location on a number line, or a division of whole numbers. And we're going to deal with all four of those types of fractions within the next few weeks. So there's your examples. 1/2, 3/4, and 6/5 are all fractions. Okay, now what is different about the 6/5? Well, the 6/5 is a improper fraction. Okay, it is a number where the numerator is bigger than the denominator. So there are more parts in the numerator than there are in the denominator. Then we have the word numerator. The numerator is the number above the fraction line in a fraction. I think most of us know that, or at least after a quick reminder, we're like, oh yeah, I know that now. We know that that's the number above, but that second sentence is really important because the numerator tells us how many pieces we have. Okay, so if I'm talking about a pizza, okay, and I have 3/4 of a pizza, the 3 tells me I have 3 pieces. Okay, so that's the important part there, is it tells you how many pieces. So then we have the denominator. The denominator is below the fraction bar. And again, a lot of us already knew that, but that second sentence is really important. The denominator tells each piece's value, or what it is worth. So if we're thinking about that pizza and I have 3/4 of a pizza, that means I have 3 pieces, but they are all worth 1/4 of the pizza. Okay, so that's something we're going to get into a little bit later on this week, but that's important that the denominator tells us what each piece's value, or how much it's worth. Then we have proper fraction. Okay, a proper fraction is a fraction less than 1. Okay, so in that very first slide where it said fraction and it was 6/5, that is not a proper fraction because that's more than 1. That's why we call that an improper fraction. Okay, so a proper fraction is a fraction less than 1. So its numerator is less than the denominator. So there's some examples: 1/2, 3/4, 5/7, and 9/10. Then we have greatest common factor, otherwise known as GCF. Okay, you'll hear me say GCF all the time. Greatest common factor. The greatest common factor is the biggest factor that is the same between 2 or more numbers. Now, just a reminder, a factor are the numbers that you multiply to get another number. Okay, that's different than the word multiple. So a factor are the numbers you multiply to get another number. So for instance, with the number 2, I multiply 1 times 2 to get 2. So if I say write out your factors, this is what I mean. 1 and 2 are the only factors of 2. Same for the number 4. 1 times 4 and 2 times 2 are factors that make up 4. So 1, 2, and 4 are the factors of 4. Okay, so they both have 1 and 2 as a factor. But since I'm looking for the greatest common factor, then that means the 2 is the biggest between them. And that is really important because that's how we then figure out how to simplify fractions, which we'll do later on this week. And kind of in the same vein, but kind of different, we have the word lowest common denominator, okay? LCD. Sometimes you might also hear me say lowest common multiple or LCM, okay? And that means the same thing. When I'm talking about lowest common denominators, I'm talking about multiples. So remember, factors and multiples are different things, okay? Factors, you are multiplying numbers to get another number, okay? But multiples, remember, that is skip counting. And that goes on forever. So that never ends, okay? So the lowest common denominator is the smallest denominator that is the same between two or more numbers, okay? So for instance, here's why that makes a really big difference, okay? If I want to add 1/2 plus 3/4, I cannot add them unless they have the same denominator, okay? That is impossible. I have to have the same denominator. So because of that, I have to find a common denominator. Well, I want to find the lowest common denominator because then that gives me less work to have to do later on. If I'm adding 1/2 plus 3/4 and I find my lowest common denominator, chances are I will not have to simplify later on, which means there's one step I don't have to do. So it's kind of like either I find my lowest common denominator or I have to simplify later. Okay, so one of those steps has to happen, and I guess, once you practice a little bit, you can decide which one you like. I personally like lowest common denominator because then I don't even have to think about simplifying later. Okay, so what I do when I'm trying to do 1/2 plus 3/4 is I take both of those denominators and I write out a list of multiples. Okay, so my list of multiples for 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and then the 3 dots that tell me it goes on forever. Okay. My list of multiples for 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, and again, 3 dots that tell me it goes on forever. So those two numbers have a whole lot of numbers of common denominators, okay? Because just in that list, they have 4, 8, 12, well, I guess technically they don't have the 12, 16, and 20, but if I were to continue up here, remember they'd have the 12, 16, and 20, okay? But out of all of those, the 4 is the lowest common denominator, okay? And that is important because then when I am changing, I would change my 1/2 into fourths, but since this 3/4 is already fourths, I can keep it. And that, again, would create a very simple problem. Then we have simplest form, okay? A fraction in which the only common factor of the numerator and denominator is 1, okay? The only common factor. Remember, a factor is the numbers that you multiply to get another number, okay? So we'll talk a lot about numbers that have 1 as a numerator, and that's actually a special name, okay? If you have a fraction that has 1 as a numerator, that's called a unit fraction, okay? So unit fractions are always in simplest form because 1 only has the number 1 as a factor, 1 times 1. There's no other factor. So if you have a unit fraction like this, 1/2, 1/10, 1/80th, okay, those are all going to be simplest form because you cannot reduce them anymore. Okay, 5/7, okay, is also in simplest form because the factors of 5 are 1 and 5, and the factors of 7 are 1 and 7. Well, the only common factor that 5 and 7 have are 1. And so since I cannot divide them anymore, that would be considered simplest form. Then we have equivalent fractions. Well, equa, remember equa is a root word, which means equal. Okay, so equivalent fractions are equal fractions. They are fractions that name the same part of a whole, region, length, or set. Okay, so all I did was I used my knowledge of patterns to create. So I went by ones on my numerators and I went by twos on my denominators. 1/2, 2/4, 3/6, 4/8, and so on. All of these fractions are equivalent fractions. They all name 1/2. Because 2 is half of 4, 3 is half of 6, 4 is half of 8, and so on. So all of these are equal. And that concludes your fraction vocabulary number 1.